the changing demographic and economic profile of Grand Island. I'm sure you have more insights on the ground than I do, but what I have is a host of data sets that I have access to that might provide something of an empirical picture of what's going on. Within the past 2 weeks, we've been, at least in my profession, blessed with some new data. So the Census Bureau released new estimates from what's called its American Community Survey, which looks at socioeconomic, demographic, and economic characteristics of places. And then the Census Bureau's local employer household dynamics data set released some new information on actual jobs that are created in different locations and what industries they fall in. Now, the 2020 census numbers officially won't be released until next year, so the process just wrapped up recently, but I do have access to some commercial data that project out what that number is going to be, that population number for Grand Island going forward. And so the slides that I put together here are just meant to give that overview in some detail. And so I'll give you the big picture first. Which is just that Grand Island is pretty typical for a second ring or an outer ring suburb of a metropolitan region, a city like Buffalo. We tend to see that it has relatively higher income, the generational composition. So right now the predominant generation represented on the island is the baby boomer generation, with the second being what's generally classified as the millennial generation. And so that adds up pretty nicely. You think about baby boomers having children, they would grow into the millennial generation right now. And so that's why we can see a lot of consistency there. But one thing that I'll point out is that, again, thinking toward that new 2020 census number that's going to come out next year, by all accounts, your population is projected to have increased by about 3.5% since the last time we did a decennial census, since back in 2010. And so to put that in context, Erie County as a population has remained relatively flat during that time. And then of course, Buffalo has this legacy of being a shrinking city, which is on pace to lose population again for the seventh consecutive decade, basically. And so the fact that we see this 3.5% growth potentially in population over these last 10 years is a good sign. It's a strong sign that there's strong demands to be living on the island. And so what I want to do is unpack this a bit over the next couple of slides. I know I only have about 20 minutes, so I'll try not to talk too long, cut me off if need be. But I want to unpack this to think about where it's going from here. Because while there has been this strong population growth over the past 10 years, that growth is starting to slow down a bit. So whenever you take that 3.5% population growth over 10 years and distill it down to an annual growth rate, the population on Grand Island has grown by about 0.34% per year for 10 years. Now, projecting that out, we're assuming based on some of the internal demographic structure, as well as migration patterns, that annual population growth rate is going to be cut in half effectively, for about 0.16% per year. And so what that means, that doesn't sound like a lot, and really it's not. Think about that as by 2025, you'll get about 170 new neighbors. That's about the number of new folks in net terms that are estimated to be added to the island's population by 2025. Now, what I want to point out is that sounds almost alarmist, that growth is slowing down, we should be concerned. But a lot of my work and what my unit does over in the Co-Lab from the ILR school is we try to contextualize this, that not all growth is necessarily good. So when we see slowing down growth, when we see growth rates that are remaining flat, that's not a reason to go out and panic and think that we need to sell the farm and do everything we can to attract more people, that what we have isn't good enough. So there's a big distinction between growth, which is just a quantitative increase in something, and development, which is a qualitative increase in something. Being able to look at the stock of jobs, of businesses, of households that we have, and build on the strengths that are already there. And so this conversation came up most notably over the summer with Project Olive, when all the news was out on the Amazon warehouse potentially coming in and developing a greenfield on the island. Regardless of where you stand on that, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other, but what my unit did is we published an op-ed in the Buffalo News that was just saying, don't think that you need to go for every offer, that there are some good questions to ask during these conversations about new development or job growth, that we don't have to look at all growth as good growth. We need to think about what jobs are being created, what wages they're paying, who's going to fill them, where folks are going to live. And so what we were trying to do was set the expectations that it's okay to ask questions, right? You don't always just have to put up the flag and say that, oh no, our population is starting to flatline. We better get out there and attract the next economic development project. And so this is one of the themes that I want to try to convey today, is that some of the statistics that I'm going to present on the next few slides are going to show that slow population growth may eventually start to tilt negative, where you see some net population loss outside of that 2025 time horizon. And that is not in and of itself a reason to panic. So even if we do get into these conversations about how do we want to grow our population, if that is an ambition of the island, it doesn't always have to be by going out and generating or awarding a lot of subsidies to attract a development that might not be creating the jobs that you want that development to create. So that's just some context. Now let's get back to the data. This is typically what I do. So I taught statistics for many years. I'm used to putting people to sleep. So if you're drifting off, it's not going to bother me. But when we look at the population structure of the island, at the last decennial census, this is what it looked like. So this graphic is called a population pyramid, and it basically just breaks down the population by gender and age cohort to show you almost geometrically what the structure of the population looks like. And you can see in 2010 that this population pyramid had two bulges. One was in the 40 to really 64-year-old age bracket, and then one was in children under the age of 18, basically. And so whenever you have a population structure like that, it's relatively well balanced, but that big bulge at the bottom means that you're going to have population entering childbearing years. And so that usually sets you up for population growth. If we look at the projected pyramid for 2020, it looks a bit different. Now I'll call your attention to these lines here. Those lines are just for comparison. That's Erie County. And so even though Erie County has been aging as a county and relatively stagnant in terms of population growth, those little bulges in Erie County's lines show that there are more folks in those younger age brackets than you have there on Grand Island. That instead, what seems to be happening over these last 10 years is that bulge at the top is still there, but that bulge at the bottom has almost disappeared. Now, when I teach about these population pyramids to students, I always give this as sort of a handout, a reference guide to show you stereotypical population pyramids so you can put yours in context. And so if you look on your left, whenever a population pyramid looks like a pyramid, that's a place that's set to explode in population, because you have a lot of young folks who are going to enter childbearing years, and your birth rates are going to far outpace your death rates, and whatever migration is added to that, it sets you up for fast growth. In the United States as a whole, the shape of our population pyramid is almost rectangular, meaning that we've got balance throughout all of those age cohorts, which is almost like a ladder. You just start seeing succession up there, and so there's very slow growth. On the right, what's been typical of Germany for the past few years shows relative increases at the top of the pyramid, or relative bulges at the top of the pyramid with some contraction at the bottom. And so I want to call your attention to that one, because again, this is from a handout that I've been using for 5 years. So it's nothing that I created just to show you an example that looks like your case here. But if you look at the population pyramid for 2020 for Grand Island, it's almost identical to what you're seeing there in that negative growth, meaning net population loss type of a pyramid. That without any sort of substantial in-migration, a population pyramid that looks like this might set you on a course for slow net population loss in the years ahead after about 2025. And so where we can go next is thinking about what does that actually mean? So what sort of effect does that have on the economy, on housing, on anything else? And so I'll start with the economy, because one thing that means is that generally, when you have a population pyramid that looks like that, you're dealing with a lot of folks who have gone through a lot of professional developments, who are stable in their careers and in their household lives. And so generally that means disposable income. And so if you look at the graphic that I'm highlighting down here on the right, this just shows the income distribution on the island as compared to Erie County. Where you see green bars that are moving to the left, that means that Grand Island has disproportionately fewer people in those income brackets relative to the county. And where you see blue bars that jet out to the right, that means that Grand Island has disproportionately more folks in those income categories than Erie County. And so for Grand Island, this is again something that I'm sure intuitively you all probably know, but at all of the top income levels, income classes, Grand Island is overrepresented, meaning that basically it's an affluent community on average compared to Erie County. In the middle and lower income brackets, Grand Island has disproportionately fewer people, meaning again that you're going to have a community with more disposable income. One thing about that is, while an aging population structure might indicate that, again, the population growth levels that you're going to see aren't going to mean that you're always going to have cranes in the sky, building housing developments and everything else. What that generally means is that more disposable income means that there's more money to circulate in the economy, and that can indirectly lead to job growth. And so if we look at jobs based on Grand Island, the years here are a little bit different from the census years because this has to come from a different data product, which isn't fully caught up to the rest of the census data yet. But if we look at jobs based on the island itself, it went from about 5,000 jobs around 2002, so about 2 decades ago, to about 6,000 jobs in the current release of it. So a net increase of about 1,000 jobs over that 16 decade and a half period. Now, if we look at some specific sectors where that job growth has happened, the story almost tells itself. If you have an aging population structure, one industry that's going to have more demand is healthcare and social assistance. In that industry on the island, we went from fewer than 300 jobs in 2002 to more than 500 today. So a net increase of over 200 jobs, which again is relatively intuitive. Another industry that's always set to gain from more disposable income is something like accommodation and food services, your restaurants, fast food places, things like that. And in fact, this has been really the industry that's kind of exploded in terms of jobs based on the island, where there were nearly 320 new jobs created over the last decade and a half. So for 114% growth in jobs in that industry, which accounts for nearly 1/3 of all jobs that were net gained on the island in that time period. And so that's what the implications are for the economy, that you're not, again, going to see cranes in the sky all the time. You're not going to see this demand for huge developments, maybe with the obvious exception of the Amazon Greenfield Project Olive. But you are going to see that more disposable income should indirectly contribute to job creation in some other industries through increased demand. If we turn to the housing market, so this has been one of my specialties over the past decade or so. My partner and I, we've done housing plans or housing strategy documents for several of the municipalities here in Erie County. And so because we were working for so many municipalities, that led us just to analyze the market as a whole for Erie County and try to separate out where there are relative strengths and weaknesses. And so as part of that project, we developed what we call our Erie County Housing Market Position Index, which is a mouthful, and it's created through some fairly sophisticated statistical models that take into consideration what a typical housing unit looks like at a very fine resolution of geography, what a typical price for that unit would be, and what the demand is. So how many people would actually pay the typical going price of a given house. And so when we map this out for all of Erie County, this is just showing relative ranks. Grand Island tends to be in what we would call the hotter markets, shades of red. So shades of red here are markets where prices are relatively high for the county and demand is relatively strong, meaning that folks are willing to pay those higher prices that houses are selling. If we try to aggregate this over to the municipality scale and think about where Grand Island might rank up with other municipalities locally, again, it's in the high end of the distribution. It's comparable to places like the town of Aurora and Hamburg, and maybe just below markets like Clarence, Amherst, and Orchard Park. And I'll get to why in a moment. But one of the big things to keep in mind is even though the island might be behind some of those places in terms of our overall index, which takes account of demand and sales, in terms of typical price for a typical unit, the island is right up there comparable with just about any other hot market in the area. That prices look similar to what they look like in, again, some of the new build areas of Amherst or Orchard Park. Now, when we get to what that index is all about, it's that housing market position index. What it's showing is, again, relative position in the region. And it's based on those two criteria again: sales prices for typical units after controlling for all of their attributes. Now, our models account for about 24 different variables, but then also demand. So how many people are actually paying those prices for those units? And when we look at that overall index for Grand Island over time, a decade ago, the island was a top 5 market, a top 5 hot market in terms of high demand, high price. That's sort of tapered off over time, and our projections show that it's going to continue to fall slightly in the next couple of years. It's still, a top 7, top 8, top 9 market, but its relative position has gone down slightly. And some of those statistics that I just showed you have a lot to do with that. And here's why. Even though our model accounts for like 24 variables, as I said, the single strongest predictor of that index of strong housing markets are still schools. People are still influenced by school district performance. And so when we look at housing prices relative to school district performance, just doing sort of an eyeball comparison, we tend to see this relationship where light shades line up with light shades and dark shades line up with dark shades. And dark shades mean high prices on the left and high performing school districts on the right. We chose blue and red here purposely. If you combine them, they make purple, right? And so where you see dark purple here, those are really strong housing markets. And so the deepest shades of purple that we see are Clarence, East Aurora, and Amherst, with Grand Island pretty much up there in the mix. But because school district performance is such a strong indicator of housing market position, it's worthwhile to look at school district performance in Grand Island. It's still exceptional, right? So I don't want to say anything against that, but there are folks when they're home buying, they look to the all-powerful Buffalo Business First Index to see where a school district ranks in Western New York. And the Buffalo Business First ranking for Grand Island school districts, while Grand Island was a top 7 district again a decade ago, at the same time Grand Island was a top 5 housing market with our index, that ranking has tapered off over time. And that's not to say that the schools are underperforming or challenged in any way. It's just showing that relatively in this 96 set of 96 districts in Western New York, other districts have been either catching up and then eventually even overtaking the strong performance that Grand Island has historically had. And now again, this is all very conditional because a 14th ranked school district out of 96 districts is still in the 85th percentile. Again, it's still exceptional. It's just not where it was a decade ago. And so a powerful equation here for you is that when we have an aging population structure with that population pyramid that I showed you, and then potentially lower school-based migration as families are choosing to go to those districts that have been overtaking Grand Island in those business first rankings, what that tends to equal are smaller household sizes. And so while households have grown over the past decade, so the top bar here shows households today, the bottom bar shows the number of households in 2010 at the decennial census. So there are more households today, but where the growth is really in the lower end of household size, in 1 and 2 person households. So all of this is to say that the island is experiencing demographic change. Demographic change to elected officials, to the economic development world, is usually a sign of panic, right? It's time to press the red button and say that we need to grow at all costs. All growth is good. And it leads to what we tend to call in my line of work, low road economic strategies. And so I'm going to give you an example of what that means on the next slide, but I'll preface this by saying that an equation like this doesn't have to mean that we need to pursue growth at all costs and that all growth is good growth. And so I'll revisit both of those points here in a moment. But what we mean by low road economic strategies is what was traditionally called in my field of urban development smokestack chasing. And of course, we're not chasing smokestacks anymore, but this is the practice where large subsidies are given out to private firms that usually don't need them to bring them in and to show quantitative increases, to show growth in jobs or what have you. And so the latest example of this is everywhere, Amazon, where everyone's was bidding to get Amazon's HQ2. There are still jurisdictions out there that are trying to throw everything at Amazon to put a warehouse or a distribution center. in their locality. And so that's kind of our new smokestack chasing. Another type of new smokestack chasing is what we tend to pejoratively call stalking the creative class, trying to create businesses or establishments that are going to bring in workers who are associated with a class of individuals that are in tech jobs, that are of a certain age group or what have you. And so this has been an obsession with a lot of the economic development world for a while, thinking that if we can attract these creative class members in, that's going to solve all of our problems. And so what all of these low road strategies have in common is that they're looking out. They're trying to think about who can we bring into our location to make it a better location instead of looking in and realizing what we have. And so that's why I'm happy to be speaking with all of you. You're a community-based organization that looks inward, that looks to build community and thinks about the assets that we have locally that can serve as the basis for future growth. If we want more people, it's not that we have to go out and pull them in and try to fish them in and pull them with all of our might. It's just that we want to build community. We want to make a community that's so impelling that people are drawn here automatically, not because we're going to pull them in. And so this is what my research and my research unit is all about, trying to understand what high road economic development is, how we can build community wealth instead of chasing smokestacks, and how we can do this at all scales, from the smallest of towns to the largest of cities and regions. And so, given the demographic change that's occurring on the island, some of these economic development strategies are going to creep up, just as they did for Amazon over the summer. And so I'm just here to let you know that my unit is always willing to help strategize about what it means to do high road economic development amidst a demographic transition. And so that is all I've got for you today. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, that was excellent.
Thank you.
Russell, what do you think about the proposal for the new warehouse where the Amazon was? What's going on there?
So you might have guessed that I'm probably not the biggest fan of that strategy, and so it's just an odd thing to me to think about putting a distribution center on an island, at all. But why my unit interjected was just saying that even though Amazon was advertising that the jobs that were going to be created were going to, you'd have 50% of jobs, making over $40,000 a year. They weren't looking at the actual population that we have and figuring out if the people that we have locally would be filling those jobs or if they'd be bringing them in from another location. And so that's, again, what our unit's mantra is that we're not always trying to attract different people. Let's look to see if they're unemployed or underemployed folks here locally and if they could fill these jobs. If not, then any job creation strategy like an Amazon warehouse should include some sort of training apprenticeship program that's going to create a pipeline so that our residents are going to be the ones filling those jobs and benefiting from them, and not just shipping them off and using our resources to attract people from other locations.
Well, they had the new proposal for a huge warehouse in the same area, correct?
They do, yeah.
Yeah, the people who own the land, because of the Amazon interest, has realized that there's a need for warehouse square footage, and so they're now speculatively going to build a warehouse, and they're actually increasing the footprint, although they're staying within the height restrictions, so that they're trying to get through the gauntlet of approvals, not requiring any kind of zoning change.
Right, coming in right under the requirements. And that's a very typical practice. And so what that takes is just like what happened over the summer. It takes the community out there being vocal and disrupting that process. But that's also a great example. So I'm a geographer by training. That's a good example of sort of the jurisdictional balkanization that happens in economic development. Because we do have capacity for warehousing in so many other jurisdictions. I did an economic development strategy or contributed to one for Cheektowaga a couple of years back. And so they have capacity for warehousing, and they're interested in attracting more warehousing, but then you have greenfield sites that are being targeted by developers because they know that that's going to be where more subsidies are. And so that just shows this sort of lack of regional cohesion in a lot of these strategies too.
That certainly has come up on some of the discussion, is that we know that there are empty warehouses out there. Why don't that capacity go there? And Grand Island, we have a fairly good sized contingent of people who are interested in green technology types of things and ecotourism, things that are compatible with the kind of unique location that we're at.
Right. Yeah, and I was so encouraged by the community's voice over the summer and the fact that it actually derailed the plans. That's exactly what all the research that we do at our unit over in the Buffalo Co-Lab is directed at just that, trying to figure out how communities can get organized and take back development control and make sure that you get the development that you want. And so bravo to you know, all of the community members up on Grand Island who are able to do that. It's very heartwarming.
So I'm curious, we've got this big Point Huron apartment complex that came in on Grand Island Boulevard. And so that would attract the smaller family unit type of population. I know there's quite a bit of them are people who are temporary here for the air base, are staying in those properties. And so that would have contributed to the skew of the census to those smaller family units.
Okay, yeah, it's always helpful to have that context. Looking at the numbers, we don't get the full story.
When you say greenfields, how does that apply or compare to a brownfield? Because the subsidies normally come with brownfields being converted. I wasn't sure where you were getting subsidies with greenfields.
No. So usually the subsidies come in, for brownfields and areas that have exhibited contamination. That's where really strong subsidies come in at the federal level included, not just state and local subsidies. Greenfield development often gets subsidies because it's breaking new ground. And so it's this ability to state that you're coming in and contributing to some sort of a comprehensive plan or goal for new job creation, that you have site control over an area. And because of that, you have the ability to make this job creation happen, but you're only going to do it if you get, X million of dollars in subsidies to be able to start with the construction and everything else. So
these are like IDA projects?
Usually, yes.
Okay, and with the IDA projects, they're looking, if they're a local IDA, for example, like I don't know if we have one. I know Amherst has one.
Mm-hmm.
I think we may. Then they're looking for job development of the residents of that town, or just general job development.
Usually just general. So the requirement is that the company has to publish the number of jobs that they anticipate to create that are going to be temporary in construction, as well as permanent jobs at the location once it's developed. There aren't hard rules on the books right now that in all cases would require those companies to state the wage level of the jobs that are being created or the benefits that are going to be provided to the workers. They're just sort of held up on one number, and there aren't even any sort of economic development regulations at the local or state level that would put a maximum cap on the number of on the subsidy per job. There is legislation in the state assembly right now that's in the Economic Development Committee that would put a cap on the subsidy value, so that all the subsidies that went to a project would have to max out at, say, $6,000 per qualifying job, but there's nothing like that on the books right now. And so, generally the conversation that you hear about job creation is not something that's strictly enforced. So after the project gets developed, if they don't live up to those expectations, there's no clawback where the money comes back, usually written into the provisions. It's just sort of, oops, we weren't able to deliver on everything. We'll do better next time.
Now, one more question in relation to the development projects. What happens to empty space that they're trying to bring back in, which is happening with a lot of the retail space now? So would that be considered under a greenfield or not?
No. So that's more of a reuse. So yeah. With vacant storefronts in particular, there aren't often a lot of subsidy dollars out there. It's more for new development projects. In order to attract somebody to a vacant storefront or something like that, there are, IDA provisions that get in there and negotiations that try to sweeten the pot a little bit for a new retailer or a new restaurant, but they're not as strong as new developments.
Thank you.
We seem to be the place to put all the solar farms. Any other questions?
No,
Very informative. Thank you.
Very
Yes.
nice.
Yeah, good presentation. Very good.
Thank you
Very
for inviting
excellent.
me.
And I will be sharing this recording.